Hi, everyone. Welcome to Rhode Island Humanities 2023-2024 Major and Mini Grants Information Session. We're so happy to have you here and really grateful for your interest in our grant making program. And we're going to give an overview of that program today, as well as share with you some exciting updates we've made. So thanks so much, and we'll get started. So my name is Julia Renaud. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Associate Director of Grants and Strategic Initiatives at the Council, so I work on all things grant making.
Hi, everyone. I'm Melissa Wong. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the grant making program coordinator here at the council. So I work alongside Julia on all things grant making. You can reach us both at grants@rihumanities.org. So I'm just going to go over our goals for today's session. We're going to kick it off with an introduction to the council, so who we are, our mission, and also our funding priorities. We're also going to be going over an overview of our grant opportunities, including timeline and eligibility requirements. From there, we're going to be doing an overview of application content and selection of staff tips. And then we're going to be answering some key questions. So what happens after I submit my application? How do I apply? And are there any resources to help me? As always, please contact us with any questions. Again, you can reach us at grants@rihumanities.org. And then the last thing is I did want to denote that we made a number of recent updates to our program, hopefully that they're going to make the program clearer and more easy for you to navigate, but you can see all the changes for our program. They're going to be denoted with an asterisk throughout these slides.
Thanks so much, Melissa. So we wanted to start off by sharing our mission with you because it really does drive and animate everything we do at the council, including our grant making program. It's actually a really great blueprint for that. So our mission is the Rhode Island Council for the Humanities seeds, supports, and strengthens public history, cultural heritage, civic education, and community engagement by and for all Rhode Islanders. So seed, support, and strengthen, that's really our approach to grant making and our philosophy about grant making, that we know that there's amazing public humanities work going on all over Rhode Island, and we're really here to support that work and strengthen it and, provide resources and connections where we can. In terms of what we fund, this isn't a complete listing, but it's a great place to start. So public history, cultural heritage, civic education, and community engagement are all fall under what we fund. And then the program is really by and for all Rhode Islanders. And we take that charge seriously, and it is aspirational. We're always working towards it, and we can always realize it more fully. But that is our mission and our goal. So in terms of who we are, we were founded in 1973, so it's our 50th anniversary year, which is exciting, and that's why you see that little 50 in the upper left corner of the slides. We're a private 501c3 nonprofit organization, so we are not a government organization. We're a private nonprofit, but we are affiliated with the National Endowment for the Humanities, which is a federal agency. So we do have that relationship with the federal government, and we receive federal funding, which I'll get to in a bit. And something that we find very inspiring is that Senator Claiborne Pell of Rhode Island was instrumental in the founding of the National Endowment for the Humanities, as well as the National Endowment for the Arts in 1965. So really a strong connection there between the NEH and Rhode Island and the legacy of the NEH. So we're one of 56 state and territorial humanities councils. We have a lot of amazing colleagues, and if you've lived in other states or territories, you probably encountered them. And like I said, we do receive funding from the federal government, as well as private funding. So that could be from individual donors, foundation grants, sponsorships, etc. And actually, for the first time this year, we were included in the budget for the state of Rhode Island in the legislative budget. So that is very exciting for us as well. So in terms of what we fund, as you can tell by our name, we are focused on funding the public humanities in Rhode Island. And so we wanted to give a bit more context of how we think about that. So you'll see these asterisks next to these questions. We have provided this year in our grant guidelines the definitions and kind of explanations of how we think about these terms. The way we think about these terms hasn't changed. It's just that we've actually written it down and put it in the guidelines to aid everybody. So hopefully that's helpful. But in terms of, the first question, what are the humanities? We think about the humanities as a collection of disciplines and practices focused on human thought, history, and culture. And the NEH in the founding legislation gave a list of those, which we've included in the guidelines. I'm not going to read them all here, but just a few examples. That includes literature, history, philosophy, comparative religion, art history, as well as, our disciplines around our diverse heritage, traditions, and history. So that the list from the NEH legislation isn't all-encompassing. There's also, we think of cultural heritage as being part of the humanities, civic education as being part of the humanities. So if you're not sure, just reach out to us and we can talk about it. But in terms of, why the humanities are important, there's a lot of reasons and a lot of ways to think about that. The National Humanities Center shed some light on this by saying, humanities research adds to our knowledge of the world as scholars investigate differences between cultures and communities around the world and across time, consider the ways art is made and received, or unveil the undercurrents that have shaped history. Humanities education encourages students to think creatively and critically, to reason and ask questions. And we also at the council see the humanities as really contributing to the civic health of Rhode Island and the country and the world. The founding legislation of the NEH states that democracy demands wisdom and vision in its citizens, and we believe that the humanities are uniquely equipped to cultivate this. So that's another real place that we find our work meaningful and inspiring, and your work meaningful and inspiring as well. I do also just want to note that the humanities are different from humanitarianism, which is the promotion of human welfare writ large, and they're also distinct from the practice of fine and performing arts. So next question, what is humanities content? So humanities content is, we really think of it as topics that are in any of those disciplines and practices that we talked about in the humanities. So some examples could be the history of fishing communities in Point Judith, the cultural heritage of the Cambodian community in Providence, or you could think about it in terms of civics projects in middle schools across the state that are maybe they're engaging with how the Rhode Island state legislature works. So those are all different. There are so many topics in the humanities that could be humanities content, but those are just a few examples. And then in terms of humanities methods, we think of those as the methods that are used in these practices and disciplines. So some examples of that are close reading, documentation, interpretation, storytelling, contextualization, dialogue, discussion, and debate. And you can find some more examples in our grant guidelines. So finally, we've talked about what the humanities are. So what are the public humanities, right? Which is what we fund. So we think of the public humanities as what happens when people engage together. That's key, engage together with humanities content and methods outside of academic formats. So these projects, these public humanities projects and public humanities work can take so many different forms. It could be an exhibition documenting the history of a neighborhood, a cultural heritage festival, celebrating a certain ethnic community. It could be a panel discussion on the historical context of a piece of theater. It could be a documentary film examining regional culture, or a digital video series educating voters on the legislative process. So this is just a handful of examples, but you see a pretty rich and diverse field. There are organizations that do public humanities work. Some of them are historical and cultural museums, cultural heritage societies, historical sites, libraries, and historical and preservation societies. And schools and universities also do this work too. But it doesn't have to be an organization. Individuals, community practitioners do amazing public humanities work as well, and we support that. So if you'd like kind of more ideas and examples of what this work can look like, encourage you to look at our recent grants page on our website to get some of that flavor. So in terms of what this program is funding, and what the budget for that looks like, the Major and Mini Grant Program is federally funded. So as I mentioned, the council receives money from the federal government. Some of that goes towards this grant making program. And a lot of the regulations that you'll hear about later are because of the fact that this is federal money that's being administered. So in terms of our annual major and mini grants budget for this year, it's $174,000, which is it's in the range of, what it's been for the last 5 or so years. And that will translate likely to about 30 to 35 grants over the course of the year. So roughly 15 or so major grants, and then, maybe 15 to 20 mini grants, depending on the size of the request. So for this, what we call fiscal year 24, which is November 2023 to October 2024. Like I said, we'll have major and mini project grants, and that is important. These are project grants as distinct from general operating support grants. General operating support grants are kind of meant to support all activities of an organization, from rent to staff to marketing. Those really just go towards the general operations. Project grants, which is what we give out, are really meant to support a specific project that has a start and end and, does something specifically. So we support research projects, public projects, and documentary film and media projects. And, as the slide says, there are full definitions of those in the grant guidelines, but I'll just share a bit about how we think of each of these. Overall, all of these, we look that they explore humanities content using humanities methods, so that's a through line. And then we also, across all kinds of project grants we give within this program, we prioritize funding projects that have a clear connection to an impact in Rhode Island. So in terms of research projects, those are typically driven by one or several research questions that the grantee would seek to investigate. And by the end of the project, usually the grantee has come to some key findings related to these research questions, which they then share with the public in a format of their choosing. So that could be a lecture, it could be an exhibition, a website, panel discussion, podcast, blog post, however you like. And usually the significant majority of time and expenses within research projects go towards that research part of the project rather than the public presentation. And also research projects, they can be just they can end when the project ends, or sometimes they're part of a bigger project like a documentary film. So for public projects, those can take many forms, which we've already, I've already mentioned a number of them, the exhibition, the website, and so forth. What they do have in common is that focus on humanities content and methods, and their engagement with communities as co-creators, collaborators, partners, participants, and audience members. And these projects are typically focused on the creation of that public-facing output, whatever that is, and the significant majority of the time and expenses are usually allocated to the development and realization of that output. And then documentary film and media projects. We do fund documentary film and media projects that, as I mentioned earlier, explore public humanities content or explore humanities content using humanities methods, as well as, have a connection to an impact in Rhode Island. And yes, it could be a documentary film, it could be a different kind of media project like a podcast or so forth. But those projects actually have their own grant sequencing. And so if you'd like to know more about that, recommend that you look at page 6 of our grant guidelines for those details, and you're welcome to reach out to us with any questions about that.
Thank you, Julia. So we've mentioned our grant guidelines a few times, and so I just want to point you to, if you'd like to check them out, please visit our website, rihumanities.org, and click on the grants page. You'll see the grant guidelines linked there, and you'll also see it linked throughout all of our applications in our online grant portal. So this document is your friend. Everything we're going to be going over in today's session is also listed in the grant guidelines. So please consider this your one-stop shop for our major and mini grant program. But of course, if you still have a question after checking out the guidelines, feel free to reach out to myself and Julia. So we've talked a little bit about the major grant program, but we're really going to get into it now. So what types of projects do we fund with major grants? So we fund public projects and documentary film and media, and Julia just touched on how we think about those types of projects. So major grants are for requests from $2,000 and up to $12,000. So there's two different phases that you can ask for in a major grant. So you can request up to $5,000 if your project is in the research, planning, and development stage, and you can request up to $12,000 for production and implementation stages. I'll also note that only eligible organizations can apply for major grants. And don't worry, we will go over what it means to be an eligible organization and how we think about that. We do accept fiscal sponsorship. So if you're an individual or an organization that might not fall within the eligible organization umbrella, you can work with a sponsoring organization that is eligible. And that's how we think about fiscal sponsorship. So if you have any questions, please reach out. And then we do just want to highlight that all of our grant funded projects must be free, open, and accessible to the public. And Julia touched on this a little bit earlier. That is because of our funding is federal funding. And so we want everyone to be able to enjoy and experience your project. And that's why the grant funded aspects of your project must be free, open, and accessible to the public. So now I'm going to go over our major grants timeline. So we have an annual cycle for our major grants, which means that we accept applications for major grants once per year. The process kicks off with a letter of intent form, and that will be available on our grant making portal starting October 2nd. And it's a rolling deadline, so you can submit your letter of intent form anytime between October 2nd and December 1st. You'll note the asterisk here because that is a recent change to our program. We now have a rolling deadline, as I mentioned, and before this letter of intent form was only available for 1 month. So now you have about 2 months to think through your project and submit that form. From there, staff will respond to your letter of intent form within 2 weeks of whenever you submit it. So when we respond, we usually just check for all the forms for eligibility and then also provide any feedback that we hope will be helpful as you're making your application. So after you submit your letter of intent form, please expect to hear from us within 2 weeks of your submission. And then just so you know, the full letter of intent form, that form that's available on our grant making portal, it's due December 1st. So after you submit your letter of intent form and you get your staff feedback, we do grant you permission access to our major grant application, also in our online grant portal. There's 2 deadlines that are relevant to this part of the process. So if you would like application feedback on a draft, you can let us know that you'd like feedback by December 8th. And how you would do that is you would have your application draft in our portal. You can shoot us an email at grants@rihumanities.org. We'll take a look at your draft and leave some notes and comments and then get that feedback back to you by the end of the month. The important deadline here is January 16th, 2024. That's when your full major grant application is due in our online grant portal. And that we've actually shifted all of the due date times from 5 p.m. to 11:59 p.m. So that deadline is January 16th, 2024 at 11:59 p.m. And then from there, we have our own review process with panels and discussions. And from there, you'll be notified of award decisions by March 20th, 2024.
Thank you, Melissa. So I wanted to share a bit about mini grants as well. So in terms of the types of projects we fund with mini grants, we fund research projects, including documentary, film, and media research, as well as public projects. And I'll note that research projects, this is the only place that we do fund those. So there are not research project major grants. And also with the documentary, film, and media, that would be the first phase of that sequence that I mentioned. That's described in the grant guidelines. So you'd apply under the research project umbrella if you wanted to get funding for research for that documentary, film, and media project. So as indicated by the name, these are for less money than the major grants. It's for requests for up to $2,000. And eligible individuals and organizations may apply for research projects, and they may also apply for public projects. So this is a change from our program before. Previously, individuals were only able to apply for research projects, and organizations were only able to apply for public projects. Now, individuals could apply for a research project, they could apply for a public project, and then vice versa. So there's no restrictions for mini grants on what type of applicant you have to be to apply for what type of grant. And, as is consistent, all grant funded projects must be free, open, and accessible to the public. So to talk about timeline for that a little bit, these happen quarterly, unlike the major grants, which happen annually. And it's a bit of a shorter process. So there's no letter of intent required for mini grants. You just file the application. And we have those deadlines every 3 months on the first of the month. So November 1st, February 1st, May 1st, and August 1st. And like Melissa said, those are due by 11:59 p.m., the day of the deadline, shifted back from 5 p.m. And we are able to give feedback on mini grant application drafts that are available if you share those with us 2 weeks prior to the deadline. So you would save your draft in our grants portal and shoot us an email, just let us know you'd like us to take a look at it. We just need that much time so that we can do that and give you the feedback in time for you to incorporate it. And then we let you know the decision about 6 weeks following the deadline. So if it was November 1st, you'd learn by mid-December and so forth. So in terms of, why you might want to apply for a grant from the council, we wanted to share a few reasons that we see in our work. So I think the first one and the most obvious one is financial support. Obviously, if you did not want that, you would not apply for a grant. And that's a great reason to have that support to realize your vision. Another point is that grants do demonstrate community investment and that people outside of your team care about the project. And that can be a really big deal in terms of boosting morale and providing another perspective and validation. And, that kind of goes to a point further down that can also help to leverage additional support, resources, and funding. Other funders or potential donors are always interested to hear about existing support from a funder. We're also happy to, in as much as it's helpful or appropriate, connect you with other folks we know in the public humanities community, whether that's individuals or organizations whose work might complement yours or overlap with yours, kind of provide that networking. And we're also happy to do that even if you do not receive a grant. If you reach out to us and say, hey, I'd love to talk about who I might be in touch with around this topic or this kind of work, we're happy to do that. And then we also are happy to help promote, your project when it becomes public facing. So we have an event calendar, we put grant funded events on, we advertise in our newsletter, social media, etc. And that's also true for non-grant funded events. We're happy to put on community events and advertise them as we're able. So even if you don't receive the funding, please keep us up to date on what you're up to.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about eligibility. So who is eligible to apply for a grant from the council? So nonprofit organizations are eligible to apply. They must have 501c3 status or an equivalent federal tax exempt status. The other thing that we'll note about nonprofit organizations that apply for grants is that they must have a unique entity identifier, a UEI number. So just a little bit about what a UEI is, if that's a new term for you. If your organization receives federal funding, for example, a grant from the council, which would be federal funding, this organization would need to get a UEI, which is basically the government's way of just tracking where their money goes and identifying where it's going. They're just making sure that their money doesn't go to any organizations that they're not aware of. So this process to get a UEI, it's easy to do, and we have instructions on our website, and they're also linked in our grant applications. So if you don't have one, don't worry. We can also provide you with instructions. We know that this process can be quick and easy, and it can also take up to 4 weeks. So we do recommend that you get started on applying for your UEI number as soon as possible if you know that you want to apply for a grant. But if you run into any hiccups on the road, just please reach out to us and we'll do our best to help. So who else is eligible to apply for a grant? Individual applicants are eligible to apply for mini grants. They're not eligible to apply for major grants. If they did want to apply for a major grant, they can partner with a sponsoring nonprofit organization for major grant applications. And then who else is eligible? So municipal and state governments, including schools and libraries, and state, local, and federally recognized Indian tribal governments, colleges and universities for programs beyond the campus community. They're also eligible to apply for grants from the council. What we mean by beyond the campus community is basically is the project or program that you're applying for funding for, is it just for the school community itself, or does it try to reach beyond into the community that's located in, the community that you're trying to reach? So we're trying to support organizations and colleges and universities and eligible organizations that sort of have a reach beyond their normal audience. And then out-of-state applicants are also eligible to apply for projects with a clear Rhode Island connection and impact. And then a couple of last notes about eligibility. Organizations and individuals can only have one major or mini grant open at a time. So what that means is that if you have a grant from the council, congratulations, we're so excited for you. That means the next time you can apply for a new grant is after you've closed your previous grant. So what we mean by close is that you've submitted your final report. Just one note here, you can submit a letter of intent form, even if you do have an open major or mini grant at the moment, but you must close your already open grant by the time you submit your major grant application. And again, that deadline is January 16th, 2024. The last eligibility note that we'll note right now is that all applicants must be in good standing with the council and not be subject to the council's hiatus policy. So what we mean by good standing is that you have, what we mean by good standing, what we mean by if you're not in good standing is that if you've had a grant terminated, and a terminated grant is basically if you never filed your final report. If that's the case for you, they're really rare, and you do probably know if you've had a grant terminated, but if you have any questions, please reach out to us. We can definitely work with you to have that final report submitted and get you back in what we call good standing with the council. And then last on here is the council's hiatus policy. So this hiatus policy is for our major grant program. So if you've received major grant funding for 4 consecutive years, so that would mean 2020, 2021, 2022, and 2023, we would ask that you take the following year, which is this year, 2024, off from applying for a major grant. After taking that year off, then you would be eligible to apply for another major grant the following year. This hiatus policy is only for our major grant program. There's no hiatus policy for our mini grant program. And the main reason for this policy is that we want to encourage diversity and equity in our program. And then last, as you know by now, all grant funded projects must be free, open, and accessible to the public. And Julia, did you want to add anything about eligibility before we move on?
Well, sure. Thanks. Actually, yes. I just wanted to also add that there are a few kind of exceptions or wrinkles to the free, open, and accessible to the public policy, which is one of them, and the most common one is in the case of projects that are intended for a specific K through 12 audience, where all the students in that audience would benefit from the program. So, if you're developing curricular materials on the history of slavery in Rhode Island for fifth graders in Bristol, for example, that would not need to be further free, open, and accessible to the public. As long as all the fifth graders in Bristol had access to it. And I'll also say if you're working on something, a project that after it's finished has a longer life. So for example, an exhibition in a museum, the exhibition wouldn't have to be free for the rest of its life, but it would need to be free, open, and accessible to the public for, at least some advertised amounts of time. So maybe you have a free day or several where anybody can come take a look. So those are a few of the things that we think about. And if you have any further questions about that, let us know.
Thank you. So here we have some selected frequently asked questions. Julia, is there a standard timeline for a council grant funded project?
So in short, no. It's really up to you what the timeline for your project is. So you can set your own project end date. And with the kinds of projects we typically fund, those timelines don't tend to be more than 1.5 years or 2 years. But also if you need an extension during the time, while the project is open, that as long as you're in communication with us and things are still moving forward, that's typically fine. I will say just one thing is that we can't fund anything retroactively. So all the expenses for your account and your project start date must be at least 6 weeks after the award deadline for mini grants and at least after March 20th for major grants, because those are the days, when we know that you will have received the award if you're receiving the award. So yeah, so for example, if it's a November mini grant, you wouldn't want to put your project start date earlier than December 15th. But other than that, totally up to you.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Do I have to write a letter for the major grant letter of intent requirement?
No, and in fact, we ask that you please do not. So it's a little confusing because it's called a letter of intent, but that actually refers to a specific form that you access through our grants portal. And that's the way that you submit that. So if you do write a letter, we'll read it, we'll appreciate it, and then we'll ask you to fill out that form. So please, we ask that you just do that in the first place.
Okay, got it. Thank you. Can I submit both a November mini grant application and a major grant letter of intent form?
So yes, with some caveats. So first of all, if you have two different projects, you couldn't submit two applications for the same project. So that's the first thing to think about. But say you have two projects, one of them is perfect for a mini grant, one of them is perfect for a major grant. If you got that November mini grant, you would then have to withdraw from the major grant application process because you can only have a major or mini grant open at a time. So, if you'd like to go through that, you can, but it's kind of a balancing act, and ultimately you could not end up with both grants, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Okay, moving on. So we've talked about the letter of intent form. I'm going to be going over just an overview of what's actually involved in the form. So it starts off with an eligibility check, which we went over a little bit ago about what makes you an eligible applicant. From there, we ask for some contact information of the person filling out the form, as well as your project team, and the information of the organization applying. If you have that information, that's great. If you don't, that's totally fine at this stage. This letter of intent form is actually non-binding, which we'll talk a little bit about. We also ask for the name of your project and its estimated start and end dates, as well as what format is your project in and what phase are you in? Is it for a development stage or for an implementation stage? We ask for your estimated request from the council. Are you requesting $5,000, $8,000, $12,000? That's all up to you. We ask for a short synopsis of your project. And then last, we ask you to identify the humanities content and humanities methods in your project.
Thanks, Melissa. So we also wanted to kind of walk through with you what you can expect to see on our full applications. So for major and mini grants, the public projects applications are similar. So first off, there will be eligibility checks, and then there will be a question where you can identify if you're an individual applicant or an organizational applicant. You fill out the same form regardless, but the form actually changes depending on your answer to that question and shows you the right questions for the type of applicant you are. So definitely recommend checking that box early, as you're filling it out so that you see all the right questions as you're going through. So then we ask for applicant information. So we ask for who the project director is. So this is the person primarily responsible for managing and executing the project. So if you're the individual applicant, you'll be the project director. If it's a grant to an organization, often the project director is the person kind of who's the point person for that project at the organization. And if an organization is serving as a fiscal sponsor for an individual for a major grant, the individual will often be the project director. I will note that the project director cannot be the same person as the authorizing official, and now I'll talk about who that is. So that's for organizations only, and that's a person with legal and fiscal responsibility for the grant on behalf of the organization. So, that could be the executive director, the chair of the board treasurer, the president. It's often somebody who can sign a contract or write a check for the organization. That's another way to think about it, but someone with that standing. So, and those two people, again, cannot be the same person. And we also ask for organizational information for organizational applicants. And just to confirm, and again, in the case of, well, if you are an organizational grantee, including if you're a fiscal sponsor, you are then responsible for the grant, including the project and the budget as described in the application. And there's kind of more details about all of this in our grant guidelines as well. So from there, our application is really broken into 3 parts, and the way we're labeling these parts is new, but the content really isn't. So if you're familiar with our application, I think you'll recognize a lot of the questions, even if maybe they're in a slightly different order or rephrased. But the first big section is the project plan, which hopefully is kind of intuitive that we're asking about that. So we asked for your start and end date. We asked for your synopsis, which is really kind of your elevator pitch, 2 to 3 sentences. We ask for the goals and outcomes of your project. So really, what you're trying to achieve, the change you're trying to affect with the project, and then the outputs and activities, which are really, what are you actually doing in the project? We ask for your project timeline. That's a new question, even though maybe it makes sense we'd ask, right? And you can answer this in bullet point format. So it doesn't have to be, beautifully written paragraphs. And I'll also say that throughout our application, we do indicate how, an ideal length for a response. So hopefully that's helpful. And then we ask also about your relevant skills and background and that of your team, and that could be personal or professional, skills, background, credentials, experiences, or relationships that you and your team are bringing to the project. So you can share that with us. We ask about evaluation, like how you're planning to evaluate your project. So that's really referring to the process of systematically assessing your project. or elements of it to learn more about the actual outcomes and impacts and the success of your project as you've defined it. So the reason there's a little asterisk there is because in the past we've required, oh, sorry, there is a car going by. In the past, we've required that you use the council's own framework to develop this plan. Now we've made it such that you can use any framework that you like. If you'd like to use our toolkit and framework, you're welcome to, and that's still available. But you can really articulate that plan however you like. We'll also ask about your budget. So, because it's a grant, right? So just a few points to highlight here, and again, refer you to the guidelines for all the details. But we do have allowable and unallowable expenses. And again, a lot of this comes from it being federal funding. So definitely review that part of our grant guidelines where it says what type of expenses we don't allow. I'll just flag two of them, which can be a little trickier. So one is that we're not able to fund creation of art or performances in the arts. I will say that obviously the arts and humanities are often very much intertwined and projects draw on both. So what we can fund are humanities expenses and elements of a project that, draws on the arts. So one example of that would be, I think I mentioned it earlier, a panel discussion after a piece of theater that's, maybe with the dramaturg, the actors, the director, community leaders, maybe a scholar, excuse me. And so we could fund that program, but we would not be able to fund the production itself, is one example. And then another thing to think about is that we're not able to fund promotion of a particular political, religious, or ideological point of view, advocacy for a particular program of social or political action, support of specific public policies or legislation, or lobbying. And obviously that covers a lot of ground, and there are a lot of ways you can interpret it. I will just say that, there are many topics that have been politicized in our current climate. And, generally we don't consider topics where there's scholarly consensus to be inherently, a particularly political or ideological point of view. So the reality of the science of climate change, for example, and that climate change is happening and it's real. That wouldn't be something that we would consider inherently political or ideological. It's more the difference between encouraging people to vote, which you can definitely do, and telling people how to vote, which you would not be able to do. Or we want to encourage informed dialogue and debate that isn't directive towards a specific social or political action, if that makes sense. So happy to talk more about that if you have specific questions about a project. I'll also say that budgets should be submitted using our template, which is available on our website. And for organizations, we have a one-to-one cost share requirement. So that means that for every dollar you request from the council, you need to have $1 in your budget coming from another source. So if you have a $2,000 request from the council, you need to have at least a $4,000 budget because there'd be $2,000 coming from somewhere else. Notably, that could be coming from in-kind donations as well as cash. So if you or someone is donating your time, your labor, space, food, whatever it might be, that counts. But we do require that match. And we don't require it for individuals, but if you are able to contribute any match, that's very much appreciated. And also just one more kind of technical thing for organizations. The federal government does set limits on how much you can use in a project grant towards your indirect costs. So indirect costs are costs that are really more contributing to the overall operation of the organization. And obviously that supports a project, right? If you're printing off copies for a program for an event, and you're using your organization's copier and the person who's doing it, their time and the ink and everything, that's legitimate, but it is capped. And there is a standard rate of 10% of the grant If your organization has negotiated a higher rate with the government, you can let us know, or a different rate rather, you can let us know and provide that documentation. Usually that's only universities that have big research budget or big research contracts with the government or other organizations like that. But anyway, you can find more about that in our grant guidelines and ask us any questions. So the other two categories here that you'll see are connections to the humanities and community engagement. So similar to the letter of intent, we'll ask you about the humanities content and humanities methods in your project. We'll also ask you about humanities scholars. We do require at least one humanities scholar for every project. And for a research project mini grant to an individual, that person is considered the humanities scholar typically. But just to clarify as well, a humanities scholar could be someone with formal academic training in a humanities discipline, but they don't have to be. You know, maybe there's someone with a humanities background and expertise that comes from their lived experience, their cultural knowledge, their knowledge of community or culture's history, etc. So it doesn't necessarily have to be someone with academic training if they're bringing that expertise from elsewhere. And we have changed the format of that question to be in a table format. So we'll ask you for the scholar's name, if they have an institutional affiliation, their area of knowledge in the humanities, what they'll contribute to the project, and their level of commitment to the project at the time of the submission of the application. For community engagement, we'll also ask about partners. We think of a partner as really any individual or organization that's contributing resources to the project who's not the grantee. And so similarly, there's a table format for that. We'll ask about their name, why they're involved in a project, what they'll contribute, and their level of commitment to the project. I will say if you're doing a project say with a K through 12 population, this would be a really great place to list if you have commitments or working with any particular schools, after school programs, school districts, etc. So this is a great place to kind of demonstrate that. We also ask about your target audiences, your audience outreach plans, if you are working with K through 12 students, what your pedagogical approach is and how your project will integrate into their curriculum. And then we also ask about contributions to civic health of your project. So we've reframed this question a little bit. It used to be about civic relevancy. But like I said, we do really strongly believe in what we think is a fact that the humanities strengthen civic health. Civic health, as defined by the National Conference on Citizenship, is the way that communities are organized to define and address public problems. And so the council, we've actually identified a number of ways that we think that the work of cultural organizations does this. And so this question now is basically a series of checkboxes of all those ways. So you can look at those checkboxes, check the boxes you think your project applies to. If you don't think your project applies to any of them, you could check other, and then we have a text box where you can put how you think your project is contributing to civic health. But those boxes are there for you if you'd like to use them. And then finally, there's a place where you can upload any additional documents, letters of support, CVs of scholars, if there's any supplemental material you'd like to share. So that is, however, optional. Also, I wanted to share a bit about some different questions for the research project mini grant application. So it's mostly the same as what we just went over. However, we will ask you about the research's public outputs. So that's really where you'll talk about how you will share those findings with the public. We'll ask you about your research sources. So, and you know, those come in many different formats, including print media, audio, video, or film, archival materials that are in an institutional archive, like a university archive or library. It could be a personal archive, like a family scrapbook or a shared cultural object. And we also know that individuals can be key sources for research about community history, family history, lived experience, cultural knowledge, etc. So we just ask you to share those there. And you can also upload a bibliography if you'd like. And we also ask about your acknowledgement of our copyright policy, which is that, the creators of the grant funded out a product retains the copyright, but the council retains non-exclusive rights to share the whatever you create for educational purposes. So, and that's detailed in our agreement. And then finally, there are a few other questions for the documentary, film, and media major grants to mention. So very similar to the public project application, but we do ask about project medium and runtime, about your aesthetic and stylistic approach, ask you to confirm your commitment to a free public screening in Rhode Island. We ask for a work sample that's 20 minutes or less. And we also ask for your principal, artistic, and production staff information, and that will be in a table format like the Humanities Scholars and Partners tables. Okay, so we have a few FAQs here that I will ask Melissa. So, how long should responses to application questions be?
Okay, so that's a great question. So we do now have suggested response lengths in our application for each question. I think what the most important thing here to remember is that we're not looking for a certain response length. We're looking for your answer to each question and that it's clear to whoever's reading your application. And then as Julia mentioned earlier, some of our questions, they'll ask for 1 to 2 paragraphs. I believe the longest response requested is 3 paragraphs. I think ideal response length is up to 3 paragraphs. And then as Julie mentioned, we also have questions that you can answer in bullet point format. We also have questions that you'll input information into a table. And then we also have questions where you upload a PDF or a spreadsheet. So as long as you're answering the question completely and fully, feel free to follow the suggested response lengths or use that box to answer the question how you see fit.
Awesome, thank you. Is the major grant letter of intent form binding, and do I have to submit it to submit a full application?
Okay, 2 excellent questions. So the answer to your first question, no, the letter of intent form is not binding. So what we mean by that is, let's say you submit the letter of intent form between October 2nd and December 1st. The main purpose of the letter of intent form is to ensure that your project and your organization, if you have that lined up, if they're eligible. And the other main aspect of the letter of intent form is to start a conversation with staff so we can offer any feedback that might be helpful to your project and as you're putting together your application. But we totally understand if you don't have a sponsoring organization lined up by the time you submit a letter of intent form. You can say that that's in progress or that you're in conversation with a certain organization or certain project teams or certain scholars. You can also, we totally understand if the dates, start and end dates of your project might change between when you submit the letter of intent form and your full application. So I hope that answers the first part of your question. For the second part of your question, yes, you do have to submit a letter of intent form to get access to the major grant application. So the main thing I want to stress here is if your organization is interested in submitting an application for a major grant, fill out the letter of intent form. Again, it's non-binding. Those details can change, and we understand that they can change between when you submit the letter of intent form and your full application. Though I would say if you don't submit a letter of intent form and then you decide that you want to submit an application, we're not able to give you access to the application because if you had missed the deadline for the letter of intent form. So go ahead and fill it out. And then if you have any questions, please let us know.
Thank you. And I think maybe you also said this, but if you fill out the letter of intent and you realize that you don't want to submit the full application, that's also fine. It also doesn't bind you to submitting a full application, but it gives you the option, like Melissa was saying. Okay, do you give any extensions on application deadlines?
We don't offer any extensions. All of our application deadlines, they are hard deadlines. And this is to ensure that we're being fair to all applicants. So again, the deadline for all of our grants is 11:59 p.m. on the day of the application. deadline. So please submit on time. We're not able to offer any extensions.
What if part of my project will be free and open to the public and another part will have paid tickets?
That's a really good question. Thank you for asking it. So we completely understand that it can not be possible for a whole project to be free and open to the public for the whole time period. Julia had mentioned the example of an exhibition a few slides a few minutes ago. And so as you're thinking about your application, I would frame it so you're talking about the aspects that are going to be free and open to the public. You can certainly talk about the project as a whole, but for focusing on what you're asking for the council for funding for, we're only able to fund the aspects that are free and open to the public. So I would scope my project and frame my application around those aspects.
Thank you. And then for documentary film and media, what should I know about the required work sample?
Okay, great question. So the most important thing to know is that the work sample is required for documentary film and media applications. This is actually a really great opportunity to check out our grant guidelines. There are different requirements for the work sample depending on which phase of a documentary film and media project you're applying for. So for major grants, you can apply for script development, and you can also apply for production and post-production for a documentary film and media project. The work samples for both of those phases are slightly different, and they're all detailed in our grant guidelines. So please check out that PDF, and again, reach out if you have any questions. Cool. So we're going to be going over just a few select staff tips and observations. So firstly, do your project narrative, project budget, and timeline all tell the same story? So what we mean by this is that our application asks for a lot of information and a lot of details about the project that you have in mind. From all these aspects, there's narrative questions, there's a budget spreadsheet, and then we ask about your timeline. Do they all paint the same picture? Are they all talking to each other? So the best way I'd like to think about this that works for me is if I gave, this application to someone that didn't know anything about the project, would they be able to read all the materials, the budget, and the timeline and know, I know what they're going to do, I know how they're going to spend the grant funds, and I know sort of the steps involved in doing that. So that's how we like to think about, the narrative, the budget, and the timeline all talking to each other. And so this kind of piggybacks off of the second question here, or the second tip. So be clear about the scope of your project and what will be accomplished by the project end date. How will we know when it's done? So this question is super relevant if you have like a super big project with lots of different elements and you're asking for funding for a very specific part of your project. So like as an example, let's say that your project is like a 3-day festival, and the first day of the festival is going to be free and open to the public, and the other 2 days are going to have, some sort of ticketed event. I would scope my application around the part that's free and open to the public, and kind of like what will be accomplished by the end date of that day that's free and open to the public, and will the budget be lined up with the expenses that are for that day that I'm asking for funding for. So if you have a larger project, think about the smaller parts that are made up of that project, especially if you're doing a targeted application and not asking for funding for the whole project, but just one part of it. And then these last 2 points, so do you have the appropriate humanities scholars and partners committed to accomplish your project? And again, we're always happy to connect you with people and organizations that might overlap or be relevant to your work. But this question has you thinking about, who would I like to invite into this conversation in the planning phases and the implementation phases? And then lastly, does your project provide for the safety of all team members and participants? Are there backup plans in case COVID-related adjustments are necessary? And this question just gets at making sure that the project can be conducted safely and sort of serves as an impetus for project planners to start thinking of, what if something happens? Do we have a backup plan? Are there sort of any like recording options, any hybrid options? Is there a way that we can pivot this? And again, we're always happy to help you talk through those pivot plans and any changes that might come up. And then lastly, start thinking about your project as early as possible and reach out to us with any questions.
Thanks, Melissa. So I wanted to share a little bit about what happens once you submit your application. So first of all, staff, we don't serve as reviewers of applications. We really are here to facilitate the process and to help you have the strongest application you can. So if you are reaching out to us for help or ask for our feedback, just know that we are not the people who will ultimately be evaluating your proposal. So in terms of the people who are, our reviewers are made up of our board members as well as community reviewers. And those community reviewers are compensated for their time, and they're often past grantees, as well as, other community practitioners. And we do work to make these panels as diverse across as many metrics as possible. In terms of our review process and procedures, they're a little different for mini grant and major grants. So for mini grants, because it's usually a smaller volume, it's quarterly, and there are shorter applications, the committees submit their feedback and recommendations via forms and emails, so kind of asynchronously, not in a meeting. But for major grant review committees, they do meet and have panel discussions and submit their feedback and recommendations that way. And something we're excited to share soon is the application assessment rubric that our reviewers use. So that will hopefully help you to understand how your application is being evaluated. So then if you go through this whole process and you receive the grant, we wanted to share with you what that might look like. So first of all, congratulations. It's very exciting, and we're so happy to support your work. There is required reporting. So there is an interim report required if your project timeline is over a year, and that's pretty brief. It really just kind of serves as a check-in with us. And then there is a final report required of all grantees that's due 90 days following the project end date. As I mentioned at the beginning, we also offer publicity support for grant-funded projects, as well as staff support, helping you as thought partners, rethink of a plan if it needs to be rethought, or connecting you with folks in our network if that's helpful. So we are here. And yeah, please do proactively reach out to us if there are any requested changes to your original project, particularly with staffing, scope, timeline, and budget. We are really happy to work with you. We do understand that things change. So just reach out and we can work through those requested changes together.
So we've talked a bit about our online grant portal, which is how you're going to access all of our applications. I'm just going to walk you through how you can actually access that portal. So for the first step, you're going to visit our website, which is rihumanities.org. From there, you're going to click on grants at the top, and then that'll bring you to our grant making page, which is featured here. From there, you're going to click on apply for a mini or major grant, which is circled in red, and that's going to bring you to our online grant portal. So if you've never applied for a grant from us before, you can create an account. You'll need to create an account to access those applications. It's easy to do and it's free, but if you have any troubleshooting grant portal questions, please reach out to us.
And yeah, I just wanted to also share that there are more resources to help you. So the grant making page that Melissa just shared, not only is that the place you can link to our grants portal, but also there's a lot of great information on there. So there are PDFs of applications, so you don't have to go through the process of making an account in our portal if you just want to check out the questions, also the grant guidelines that we've been referring to constantly, as well as the evaluation toolkit, which is available for you as a resource in thinking about evaluation of your project. There will also be a video of this workshop, as well as a video on evaluation if you'd like. And then really, staff are a resource. It is literally our job to help you. And that's why we love our jobs. So we do have drop-in virtual office hours coming up on September 27th and October 12th, which you can register for on our website. You can also contact us ahead of the deadline to talk through your project, and we particularly recommend this if you're a first-time applicant or if you haven't applied in the last 5 years. And you can reach us at grants@rihumanities.org or at through our main council phone line. So with that, that is all the information we wanted to share today, and we're so grateful again for your interest in our program, and we really look forward to being in touch with you and learning about your project and hopefully supporting it. And thank you to Melissa for co-hosting this with me.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you all.
Okay. Have a good one.